Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to talk about Renfield, which is a movie directed by McKay, starring Nicolas, Hoult, and Awkwafina, and also, of course, Nicolas Cage as Dracula. And if you want to see Nicolas Cage playing Dracula in a very over-the-top action, comedy, horror-ish movie, then you're probably going to have some fun in this movie. Unfortunately, for me at least, I did not really enjoy this movie too much. I think it's a fine movie. I think this movie has its moments, which I'll get to in a second here, because of course we're going to be talking about spoilers for Renfield. So if you have not seen Renfield, if you have some interest, like I said, to see Dracula played by Nicolas Cage, go watch this movie because I think you will have some fun watching that section of this movie. But this movie is also kind of a little messy and all over the place. So let's just jump right into the movie. So what is this movie about? Well, essentially it follows Nicolas Hoult as, of course, Renfield, the title character of this movie, and he is a familiar, which means that he's going to go off and get anything and everything that Dracula can possibly need. A vampire needs to have a servant, and that is exactly who he is. But the movie takes a spin on it kind of being like a toxic relationship movie where you have Dracula, who is the abusive partner in this relationship. Of course, you have Renfield, who is the one being abused by Dracula, and he just wants to get out of this situationship. He does not want anything to do with Dracula after all the decades of abuse that he has dealt with. But of course, he's in a cycle of violence, and when you see cycles of violence both in real life and how it's displayed and how it's portrayed in this movie, is every single time things start to seem like they're going to get better. Dracula apologizes, he says that things are going to be different next time, and of course things fall apart and Dracula gets burned to a crisp, and now he has to kind of pick up all the pieces of Dracula to help him get back to full power, and the cycle just restarts and happens all over again. And I actually really did enjoy the first act of this movie, even though it is very choppy and messy in terms of the editing. I do think that this movie might have been cut up a little bit because it seems like some scenes kind of either end too soon or they just kind of move on to the next scene very abruptly, or just things don't feel like they flow as naturally as I think was intended. And I feel like these filmmakers are talented enough, and I think the comedy in this film is somewhat there, but again, it feels like it's always cut short from either the great joke or either a good transition from scene to scene. But either way, I dug how the movie started off in a black and white fashion, an old school like film grainy thing where you get to see the beginning of this relationship where Renfield first meets Dracula, and it goes through history until you get to see this really funny Pope scene where he's trying to, capture him in this summoning circle, and he got him in all this salt on the floor, and Renfield has to choose whether or not to let Dracula free or to, let him stay in there and to let the priest do what he needs to do. But of course, Renfield sets him free and starts this cycle of violence all over again. Of course, the makeup effects on Dracula when he's burnt to a crisp and he has to go back up to full power, it looked really good. I really was impressed with the amount of effort given to Nicolas Cage in terms of the transformation that he has into Dracula. And again, with the positives of this movie, Nicolas Cage knows exactly what movie he is in. Whenever it comes to the comedy of this character and the over-the-top nature of this character, I think Nicolas Cage absolutely nails every single scene that he has in this movie, and he has a decent amount of scenes. I do wish he was in the movie more, but of course this movie is called Renfield, and it's going to be about this abusive relationship from Renfield's perspective, and so I get that they're going to kind of separate at a certain point, and you're going to focus on Renfield more than you are going to focus on Dracula. But when Dracula was on screen, you have these characters bouncing off of each other. It was very, very entertaining. But at the beginning of the movie, as Renfield is kind of explaining his situation to all the people in this group that he is kind of letting all of it out to them, he's saying that he's stuck in this abusive relationship, he's stuck in this cycle of violence, and he doesn't know how to get out of it, and this group is trying to support him, do everything they can for him, and he's trying to figure out whether or not he's going to actually leave Dracula, and this is kind of weighing on his shoulder. And this is why I like the first act of the movie, because it really did dive into that abusive relationship kind of allegory that this movie is going for, and I think that's a really clever idea. I think this movie has a reason to exist, to tie Dracula in to a very, satirical and comedic way of, diving into what it actually means thematically. And I do think that an idea of tying a vampire and their familiar in terms of an abusive relationship is a great idea. I think the biggest, problem with this idea is that it was kind of done in the What We Do in the Shadows, both movie and TV show. And that show in the movie is so incredibly good and funny that it kind of sets a bar for this movie that is a little bit higher than this movie can possibly reach. And the one thing that does separate this from the What We Do in the Shadows universe, I guess you could say, is that the familiars actually have some powers. They can eat a bug that essentially gives them the power of a vampire, which gives them like really stylistic, fun action sequences where Renfield can use like a silver platter to cut somebody's arms off in a very fun bar scene. I think the stylistic action in this movie is also fairly entertaining, although there is so much blood and gore in this movie that it feels like it was definitely not what they intended in this movie. It was added in post, because I feel like they made an edit of this movie and it just did not work at all. And the one note that they gave the filmmakers and the visual effects artists was just, just quadruple the amount of blood that is just completely over the top and unrealistic, but it still is a very fun way way to explore this violence and action in this movie that is just, it's so over the top, it's so ridiculous, but at the same time, it's kind of fun and funny. And when Renfield is at the bar, he also gets to meet Awkwafina's character, which is also another outlet that Renfield can talk to her and try to explain all the ridiculous and unbelievable stuff that he goes through on a daily basis with Dracula. And she's also a character that can try to pull him out and try to, help him with his character growth in terms of trying to separate himself from Dracula. And so you get to start the relationship also in this first act before, of course, Dracula figures out exactly what Renfield is trying to do, and then he murders everybody at that AA group. And it's again, a very over the top and bloody and gory and just really fun to see Nicolas Cage do his thing. But now let's get into my negatives of this movie, because of course, after this first act, I do think this movie really did struggle to try to figure out a reason more so to exist besides the fun, clever idea that it sets up with the premise. And I don't think that the rest of this movie lives up to that over the top premise that it kind of promises both in the trailer, in the log line, and in that first act of this movie. In a similar way that Cocaine Bear also doesn't entirely live up to the absurdity of its title, I think this movie also lands in a very similar spot where I don't think this movie is necessarily bad. It's still entertaining enough, but I do think that the concept of this movie and the idea of this movie of it being like an allegory for an abusive relationship and a toxic relationship that Renfield is trying to get out of, it just doesn't really go anywhere with it, because you get a few scenes where you get to see Renfield eat some bugs and just murder so many people alongside Awkwafina at this one motel sequence, which I thought was a pretty fun sequence to watch. Again, the blood was so over the top where it splatter so much, even though, you don't get to see the blood interact with the actual locations, because of course it is all CG blood and they didn't plan for that much blood on set. And so again, it just felt like an added element to try to make the movie more entertaining than it was on paper. And so you get some fun scenes in the middle. You get to see Dracula try to find a new familiar, and Ben Schwartz's character, who's also running this drug operation, or I guess his mom is running the drug operation. He's kind of the loser son that is trying to live up to the family name, and he's so incredibly annoying. And when I get into my biggest negative of this movie, it's this guy. And I think there's a fine line where you can have a character that's very over the top and comedic, because I think he's trying to be somewhat of a comedic relief in this film, because he's always screaming for his mom when anything gets more intense than just slightly threatening. And so there's some idea with this character being some sort of comedic relief. I see the idea of the comedy with him. I just don't think it works. I think it's a very fine line in writing a character like this. I don't think it's the fault of Ben Schwartz. I think it's kind of the fault of the tone of the movie not really hitting the right chord, and the script of the movie not giving him enough to really chew onto. I think Ben Schwartz he really got on my nerves throughout this entire movie. And I know he's supposed to be annoying, but it just didn't work for me. And really, whenever it did focus on anything with this drug operation, again, I just really didn't care. The only thing that really tied the drug operation with Dracula and the stuff going on with Renfield and Dracula was the fact that Dracula is trying to find a new familiar, and he finds this one annoying character that just happens to be a part of this drug family. Of course, you have his mom, who is also trying to get involved with all this stuff, and all these goons get the powers of Dracula by eating bugs, and you have a big fight scene at the end of the movie, and I don't really need any of that in this film, because of course, it also ties in Awkwafina, what she's trying to do, but I was trying very hard not to fall asleep during the second act of this movie. Besides the over-the-top action sequence, that was the only time that I got a jolt of energy enough to keep me awake for the upcoming scenes, because this second act really did drag for me, and this movie's only like an hour and 26 minutes without credits, and so it just didn't have my attention. It didn't have that energy and that comedy to keep me awake in the theater. Another thing that really didn't work for me was the dynamic and the chemistry between Nicolas Hoult and Awkwafina. I think they're fine actors. I think they're really good in their respective roles. Awkwafina is incredible in The Farewell. I love that movie, one of my favorites. And I think another movie you can compare this to is Warm Bodies. And I think that's Nicolas Hoult in this movie is trying to capture the magic that he captured in Warm Bodies, because I really do like Warm Bodies. And I think this is just not as good of a version of what that movie did very successfully, because again, you have that voiceover throughout this movie. You get to hear his perspective, and you get to have some like freeze frames as he's like, being the narrator of this film, so the movie kind of pauses for a second as he can explain things, and that's exactly what happens in Warm Bodies. And so the dynamic between these two characters also didn't work as well for me as what it did in Warm Bodies with Nicolas Hoult and Teresa Palmer. I think their chemistry in that movie was great, and they're not trying to do a real big romance thing in this movie. It's just like kind of like a buddy friendship, like a an adventure movie that these two characters are going to go off and fight Dracula at the end of the movie, I just really didn't buy this friendship that they gained in this movie, because I think that this cop character, and dealing with essentially like a serial mass murderer in Renfield that's essentially feeding people to Dracula, I just didn't buy their dynamic together. I felt like it was very rushed. Again, this movie is only an hour and 26 minutes, so you don't really get a lot of time to have these characters get to know each other in a very meaningful way. So I just didn't really buy their chemistry by the end of the movie. And when we do get to the last act and all the crazy action stuff is happening, you get all these other goons that have eaten the bugs, and they're kind of the new Renfields of this movie, and you get to have Ben Schwartz and Nicolas Hoult fight at the end of this movie. And again, it's very bloody and over the top and just gory. Again, I also just didn't really care, because these goons that they're fighting and this storyline with the whole drug operation, I just didn't care. And I think that's the biggest problem with this movie, is it had a good setup, it has a good clever idea, but all this other ancillary stuff that's kind of padding the runtime, I just didn't care about. I wanted them to focus a little bit more on Renfield and Dracula themselves and that dynamic and that relationship, because once you get to the aftermath of all this bloodshed that happens in this third act, you finally get to the confrontation between Nicolas Hoult and Dracula. And I wish there was like one or two more confrontations between these two characters throughout the movie, because now you just had the beginning parts of the movie where you set up everything with these characters, and then you have the very end of the movie where you have the fallout of these characters, and throughout the entire rest of the movie, it's this drug operation. And so I really did not, it didn't have the impact that I wanted to. However, the final battle with Nicolas Cage's Dracula was very, very fun and entertaining. Of course, the cocaine circle that traps Dracula at the end of the movie was very, very funny to see. This movie also has, again, I compared it to Cocaine Bear earlier, it has a lot of cocaine in it. Maybe even slightly more, maybe the same amount of cocaine as Cocaine Bear. Either way, these two movies are very comparable. Once Dracula gets stuck in this thing, and you have Awkwafina and Nicolas Hoult at the end of this movie just absolutely beat the crap out of Dracula, and they're just trying to figure out how to kill this guy, and they don't really know how to kill him, so they're just trying to do everything. So they just absolutely mutilate this poor guy. They cut him up into little pieces, they put him in concrete, and they bury him in the ground, and it's kind of in a way where they can set up a potential sequel if this movie is successful. But again, this movie had a good first act, a fun conclusion. The last 10 minutes of it was fun to see Nicolas Hoult, Awkwafina just beat the living shit out of Dracula. It's a little bit fun to watch all that stuff, but everything else in the middle just kind of landed a bit flat for me. Again, if you're excited to see Nicolas Cage as Dracula, I think there's enough of that stuff in this movie. Even the scenes where Dracula is doing his thing with Ben Schwartz's character, you get to see just the wacky performance that he has anyway, so I guess there's something there, and you get to have the absurd action with Awkwafina and Nicolas Hoult throughout the rest of the movie. There's still some stuff to enjoy in this thing. I think if you watch it out of the premise that it has, I don't think you'll hate yourself watching this thing. I just don't see myself ever watching this movie again, so it's not the biggest recommend from me. So what are your thoughts on Renfield? If you guys had a chance to check out in theaters, definitely comment down below your thoughts and your likes and your dislikes of this movie. And also, what did you think about Nicolas Cage as Dracula? Did you think it was as amazing as they promised in the trailers? Honestly, in terms of one thing in this movie being really solid, it definitely was Nicolas Cage. As you can see, I love Nicolas Cage. I love Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, and I love the fact that he got to play this role that he apparently always wanted to play, which is just, it's kind of great. So what did you guys think about this movie? I'm very curious to hear all your guys' thoughts, and if you enjoyed this review, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel, leave a like for this review, and make sure you guys check out other videos that I have here on the channel. The Mandalorian is going to have their finale here on Wednesday, so definitely subscribe to the channel, check out reviews just like that one. Also, I reviewed Mario while playing Mario, the video game, so definitely check that one out as well. So thanks everybody for watching, and I hope to see you all in my next one.